Bloodborne is a nightmare. It has the long boss runs and oversized hitboxes of Dark Souls 1, combined with the high-speed combos of Dark Souls 3, and I have never attempted to beat this game at level 4 because I'm scared of the immense challenge. Normally I start off these videos by trying to emulate the feeling of impossible challenge I felt when I did my first level 1 run, and it usually comes across a bit fake because I already did level 1 runs of Dark Souls 1 and 3 before I made the videos, and I'm confident that I can overcome the challenge. I am not confident that I'm skilled enough to overcome Bloodborne at level 4. This may be the hardest game Fromsoft has ever made. It's much more difficult than Dark Souls, and I'm afraid it'll finally push me over the edge until I go completely insane. Will I be able to beat Ludwig, the Holy Blade, and Ebrietas without leveling up? What about the Orphan of Kos, which is said by some to be the hardest boss in gaming history, rivaled only by Malenia? Or will the nightmare consume me until I'm raging like it's a Dark Souls 2 video? I guess we'll find out in the Bloodborne level 4 run. Also, there's a boss tier list. Up first is Cleric Beast, and let me tell you, when I first played Bloodborne, I thought this boss was the biggest bunch of bull, which is another way of saying that it kicked my ass. Although I never died against any of the first bosses in Dark Souls 1 through Dark Souls 3, I got legitimately stuck against Cleric Beast until I ran out of healing blood vials and had to grind for more. It was like Bloodborne was screaming, "This game is hard, get good," which makes it all the more surprising that I did not die to Cleric Beast in this run. As it turns out, all my prior deaths were the result of my overly aggressive circle strafing playstyle. Against a boss like Asylum Demon, circle strafing can avoid entire attacks and give openings, which is true for many Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 bosses. But Cleric Beast punishes this playstyle with attacks targeted at his blind spot. This means that Cleric Beast is easier when fought like Taurus Demon, where you bait out his attacks, run backwards, then punish his combo endings before running backwards again. On the tier list, I'm gonna give Cleric Beast a solid B tier. He's an intimidating first boss who makes you respect beast-type bosses. If you play too aggressively, you'll be punished, so you need to blend aggression and passivity to overcome the beast, which is a theme to Bloodborne bosses that will be mentioned throughout this video. With Cleric Beast dead, we can move on to the next boss, and you guys already know that this one is a banger, Father Gascoigne. Keeping up with the "f you, this game is hard" energy, this guy might be the hardest second boss Fromsoft has ever produced, and I really like him. While most video game bosses settle for just being merely fun, Father Gascoigne is a whole-ass narrative experience that is communicated primarily through gameplay. Although the main character of Bloodborne is a hunter, you now find yourself being the hunted, as a crazed hunter viciously pursues you through a graveyard. Just once you get your bearings and turn the tides of battle in your favor, Gascoigne loses control of himself and turns into a werewolf-looking beast. This beast isn't too hard to beat, all you need to do is circle behind him while he goes on his blind rampages. But you're in a graveyard, and this deadly beast is backing you against a gravestone. The gravestones blocking your way turns Phase 2 into a scene from a horror movie, where you run through a graveyard looking for a clearing where you'll have room to fight, while a monster breaks through the gravestones behind you. I love it when a game can communicate a movie-like experience naturally through the gameplay, rather than forcing it onto you like with quick-time events in a cutscene. Mechanically, I really enjoyed the Phase 1 Hunter duel in this boss. You stagger him when he gets hit, but he has hyper armor heavy attacks, so you can't mindlessly stagger chain him. And at any time, Gascoigne can quickly shoot you, so you always need to be ready to dodge. Because of the prediction-based mindset involved with knowing when to dodge his gunshots and when to dodge or parry his charged heavies, Gascoigne feels like a PvP boss. PvP in Souls games plays like a prediction-based fighting game, while PvE is more like a memorization-based rhythm game, and Father Gascoigne blends these two genres into one amazing Hunter v Hunter boss. Although I just spent the whole section hyping up Gascoigne, I do feel like his moveset is just lacking a bit of complexity since it's only the second boss, so I can't put him into S tier. And I will instead settle for A+ tier, where I put Fume Knight in the Dark Souls 2 level 1 video. I also feel like his boss run is a bit too long for a hard second boss, but hey, this is Bloodborne and there's many worse boss runs ahead of us. Speaking of worse boss runs, the next boss, Blood-Starved Beast, has another long one. Mechanically, this might be one of the easiest bosses in Bloodborne. All you need to do is circle right and hit his back while he does giant combos, and he doesn't really have many blind spot attacks like Cleric Beast. The only issue is that halfway through the boss fight, it starts spewing a poison trail, and its hits also add to your poison meter, making it drain both your blood vials and antidotes, which are somewhat hard to grind for in the early game. Although this boss is mechanically easy, it's also extremely punishing because of the poison and the long boss run. I really don't like the game design approach of a boss that's mechanically simple and overly punishing. If anything, I want the opposite. And the poison trail is a bit too difficult to see clearly, so I'm gonna put this boss in C tier. It's not awful, but it's not great. But you know what boss is awful? The Witch of Hemwick at level 4. You run around in circles searching for an invisible enemy while other enemies spawn infinitely to piss you off. And if either of the witch's stasis spells hit you, then they can one-shot you so that you'll have to do the entire boring boss over again. F tier. Since access to the next area will trigger the cost of blood vials to increase, I decided to fight the optional boss Darkbeast Paarl early with a +5 weapon, and let me tell you, it was brutal. This boss took around 5 to 5.5 hours for me to beat, which for reference means that this boss took longer for me to beat than any boss in the base game of Dark Souls 1 and 3 on my first level 1 runs of those games, other than maybe Nameless King, and this is the 5th boss in the video. Did I mention that Bloodborne is really hard? Although Paarl was difficult, I'd also say that it's a better and more interesting boss at level 4. This boss has electric shock waves once it gets below half health, so it's a good idea to roll underneath him and attack his legs, then back off in anticipation of his explosion or attacks to his blind spot. Then you can bait out another attack combo to repeat the process. It sounds so simple in retrospect that I have no idea why this boss was so hard for me, although looking back on it, maybe it's because my default aggressive playstyle was being punished too heavily, combined with the fact that I fought this boss a little bit early. Overall, I'm gonna give Darkbeast Paarl A tier. It's a fun, big boss that further taught me to respect the beasts of Bloodborne's world. With a good boss defeated, I want to talk about something that Bloodborne does better than most other Fromsoft games, which is the combat. There are 3 main ways to deal damage to enemies in a Fromsoft game. You can either A. parry the enemy for an iframe riposte attack, B. hit the enemy in between their combos, or C. circle strafe the enemy to either land a backstab with iframes or hit the enemy while they attack the air in front of them. In Dark Souls, parrying is high risk, high reward. Hitting in between combos is medium risk, medium reward, and circle strafing for a backstab is low risk, high reward. Similar to the terrible flurry rush mechanic in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there should be no low risk, high reward option built into the combat, because then there's basically no reason to do any other option. What I'm trying to say is that the fundamental elements of Dark Souls' combat system is not really well balanced, and most good combat encounters is more a result of the enemy movesets and how they're placed in the level rather than the actual combat system. Bloodborne fixes all of these problems so effortlessly that it confuses me why future Fromsoft games didn't follow suit. Parrying is done with your gun, which makes it easier to land a parry since you can activate it outside of the enemy's attack range, but you can't carelessly spam the parry button because you have a limited amount of bullets. Backstabs are done by landing a fully charged heavy attack to the enemy's back instead of just a light attack, and enemies in Bloodborne tend to have more attacks that target their blind spots. In essence, this means that there isn't one low-risk, high-reward strategy that can allow you to dominate almost all of the enemies with ease like with backstabs in Dark Souls, making Bloodborne the most well-balanced combat system in the series. My only real criticism of Bloodborne combat is that the enemy variety starts to wear thin towards the endgame as the villager enemy type is reused too much, but mechanically Bloodborne has my favorite combat against normal enemies in a Fromsoft game. Well, I think it's about time we move on from combat and continue the main story of Bloodborne, which I still don't understand after multiple playthroughs with the next mainline boss, Vicar Amelia. This boss starts a peculiar trend of the required bosses being less interesting than the optional ones, and this trend will get way worse, as you already know if you've played the game. It's a really easy beast-type boss where the main difficulty comes from how hard it is to see what the hell is happening through all the strands of cloth that is in your face. Mechanically, this boss doesn't have too much going on and it's kinda hard to see, but I sort of enjoy the rhythm to the fight, so I'll give it C tier. With Vicar defeated, we have gained access to the Forbidden Woods and can challenge what many consider to be the first roadblock of the level 4 run, Shadows of Yharnam. And yeah, just like with Darkbeast Paarl, this boss was very hard and took about 3 or 4 hours to beat. Not only does this boss have a very long boss run, but there's a ton of gotcha moments in this boss. Since you're fighting 3 bosses at the same time, it would be logical to exclusively target one until the fight is a 1v2. But once any of the 3 bosses get to low health, they all transform and gain new stretchy arm attacks and can attack you across the arena. Okay, so instead of hard targeting one boss, you should lower 2 of them at the same time, and then right after they transform, kill both of them quickly so you can do a 1v1 at the end. But there's another gotcha moment. When in a 1v1 for too long, the shadow can summon multiple giant snakeheads to one-shot you, and I didn't know the dodge roll timing because I've never seen the attack before. Welp, time to do another overly long boss run. My final strategy was to lower the Pyromancer and Swordsman a bit, then target the Pyromancer during the phase change since he has less health and will die quickly, then target the Candle Shadow while avoiding the stretchy arm attacks from the Swordsman so that once you kill the Swordsman, you'll be able to kill the final Candle Shadow boss in a 1v1 before he can summon the snakes. There's like a whole order of operations to beat these guys, hopefully it wasn't too confusing. Let me level with you guys for a second. I don't always love multi-fights in Souls games, especially against 3 opponents. There's a certain level of randomness that I find annoying since it causes me to play the fight slower and give up openings. You can make the multi-fight more enjoyable by taking risks and playing aggressively, but I don't think that it's worth taking those risks when the punishment for death is a long boss run. Because of this, I'm gonna stick Shadows of Yharnam in C tier. It's not an outright bad boss, but it's difficult in a way I don't particularly enjoy. On the topic of bosses I don't enjoy, the next mandatory boss is Rom the Vacuous Spider, and if you guys have been watching this channel for a while, you should already be able to predict my opinion on this boss. It is not good, it's bad. Basically, he's a blob with spider legs and some one-shot attacks that summons a bunch of other spiders to attack you, but those spiders have hard skull helmets, so you have to circle strafe each one individually to kill them. Every time the boss loses a certain amount of health, he teleports somewhere else and summons another wave of spiders, and he does this like, I think 3 or 4 times. I'll edit in what the number is on the footage. You can choose to not kill the spiders and focus on attacking the boss, but since the boss and spiders will attack you, that means that you'll have very few openings. After trying this method and dying, I decided to kill each spider individually, and as you could have guessed, it was very boring. If Rom was an optional boss, I would skip it. I can't for the life of me understand why they couldn't take an optional boss like Darkbeast Paarl and just shove them in here instead. If Rom needs to be here because of some lore reason I don't understand, then change the lore. As you all can probably guess, Rom will be placed at the bottom of F tier. One opinion I've heard before that I agree with is that Dark Souls 3 has better quality control for bosses than Bloodborne. My main reason for thinking this is that although both games have some great standout bosses at the top, in Dark Souls 3, when a boss is bad, it's usually very easy and inoffensive, which is why I didn't even have an F tier in my Dark Souls 3 video, because there aren't really any F tier bosses, and I instead had an underwhelming tier. In Bloodborne, these F-tier fights can pretty easily one-shot you and require a bit of effort despite being boring. And in a game where about half of the bosses are optional, I wish Rom was optional too. As you guys know, I am not one to back down from a challenge, which is why I decided to beat the One Reborn at level 4 with a fire gem that reduces my damage scaling without killing any of the Pyromancer spellcasters. Since I'm unable to make mistakes in my video essays, it has nothing to do with not realizing the fire gem lowered my overall damage, or something stupid like not seeing the staircase that led to the spellcasters. That didn't happen. The One Reborn didn't take around 3.5 hours for me to beat because of all of these stupid elementary mistakes. Alright, you guys caught me. I didn't know that there was a staircase to kill the spellcasters, and I didn't check if the fire gem even helped me until after Micolash. So I didn't have the greatest time fighting the One Reborn because I had to avoid Pyromancer fire while avoiding the boss's giant melee attacks, throw up, and explosions. I basically had to open my third eye and enter a zen-like monk state to avoid all of the boss's moveset and the Pyromancer fire that I didn't always see coming while getting openings. I thought the boss was extremely annoying when fought this way, since I was juggling dodging about 4 sources of damage at the same time that were coming out at different speeds, and I was gonna put the boss in C tier, but since you can kill the Pyromancers, that's probably unfair, so I'll bump him up into B tier. With the One Reborn put to rest, we can venture into the dream world of a dead body, somehow, to fight the next boss, Micolash. And yeah, I don't really know what Fromsoft was thinking with this. First, Rom is a required boss, and now I have to run after a normal-ass NPC for long periods of time to be able to 1v1 him before he runs off again. And with all the cool hunter bosses that you can stagger upon hit, it's not like they couldn't make a fun humanoid boss for Micolash instead. This is all made worse at level 4 since Micolash's phase 2 spell can one-shot you, and then you have to do the whole marathon race over again. F tier. Although the boss quality of Bloodborne is not always 100% consistent, one thing that Bloodborne does do consistently well is the level design. I love the gothic, urban feel of the levels while scouring the city streets of Yharnam. The world feels both intriguing and genuinely horrifying. My favorite part about Bloodborne's level design is the pacing of checkpoints and shortcuts. Dark Souls 3 was overloaded with bonfires and shortcuts, which took away tension from the level design, but Bloodborne still has some of that Dark Souls 1 feeling of desperately trying to survive against a harsh world that wants to kill you. The more rare checkpoints are, the more exhilarated I feel when I finally reach one. In some ways, Bloodborne does this with better consistency than in Dark Souls 1, since some areas of Dark Souls 1 hid bonfires that really should not have been hidden since there were too few checkpoints, while Bloodborne doesn't tend to do that as much. While a lack of checkpoints definitely makes me enjoy the level design more, I dislike how it makes every boss run very long. This doesn't matter too much in Dark Souls 1, as most of the bosses aren't very difficult, but Bloodborne has some of the hardest bosses Fromsoft has ever crafted to go along with the giant boss runs. I think an ideal compromise would be to design many levels around 1 or 2 checkpoints where you unlock shortcuts, then have a final checkpoint right before the boss, kind of like what Elden Ring did with Statues of Marika. Speaking of Statues of Marika, the next boss, Martyr Logarius, would be multiple tiers better if he didn't have one of the most miserable boss runs in the game that's made much worse at level 4. Similar to the rest of Bloodborne, this level has incredible design. Fromsoft made an epic, giant ice castle and brilliantly built it all around a single checkpoint. You ascend the castle and run across its frozen rooftops to reach the boss, which is all very cool and fun. However, keeping in line with the level design's greatest weakness, the developers refused to put in a second checkpoint right before the boss, adding a giant layer of artificial difficulty that sucks the life out of you at level 4. Just like with Darkbeast Paarl, this is another boss that took about 5.5 hours to beat, but the actual fight wasn't nearly as hard as with Darkbeast, and it just feels like my time was robbed from me because of the boss run. From the moment of death, it takes about 24 seconds to respawn since Bloodborne has very long death and loading screens. Then I timed the boss run to be an additional minute and 42 seconds, meaning that it takes around 2 minutes and 6 seconds after dying to get another attempt at the boss. I mean, it's not Dark Souls 2 levels of bad, but when my first 10 plus attempts last around 30 seconds or less, this boss is extremely unfun to learn at level 4, as most of the playtime is in the loading screen instead of the actual boss. The boss itself is an alright duel, although it isn't without its problems. Some of the exploding projectiles can clip through the floor and kill you through the ground. In Phase 2 he gets a bit more aggressive, which is fun, but he also starts doing an annoying attack where he summons a flurry of swords in the air. You can stop this by hitting the sword, but sometimes his AI will spam the sword move over and over again just to stall out the fight. Logarius is an A-tier duel that's weighed down by a terrible boss run, glitches, and a few annoying attacks, so I'm going to place him in C-tier. I will probably skip this boss in any future level 4 playthroughs. The next optional boss is Amygdala, and despite being significantly easier than Logarius, he also has a much shorter boss run. Sometimes I don't understand Fromsoft's decision making. Mechanically, Amygdala is all about positioning so that you can avoid his hard to dodge combos and get hits in after he's done. This gets a little harder in Phase 2 when he rips off his arms and increases his range, making the positioning requirements more strict. Amygdala is a fun, easy boss, so I'll give him B tier, although I don't have too much to say about him. There's only 2 optional bosses left before I continue my suffering into the DLC. First up is Celestial Emissary. Funnily enough, I found that the tentacle head enemy who held the key that you need to reach this boss was much harder than the actual boss, who I ended up not dying to at all. I swear those tentacle enemies are insanely difficult. When it comes to the actual boss, I just feel like there's a few too many gimmicky bosses in Bloodborne, and I'm starting to get bored of them, so I'm gonna give this guy D tier. Although a lot of the bosses have already been pretty difficult, it's about to get a whole lot harder with the hardest boss in the base game of Bloodborne, Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos. Firstly, I'd like to say that it's really cool how you can see Vicar Amelia's boss arena on the way to Ebrietas, meaning that this cosmic horror was lurking beneath the church the whole time people were praying to it. Ebrietas was the first boss in Bloodborne that made me think, yeah, maybe I can't beat Bloodborne at level 4. The way I'd describe Ebrietas' moveset is that she's like Manus combined with Malenia combined with Dark Eater Midir combined with Smelter Demon. Okay, I know that does sound a bit silly, but I mean it. She has Manus' big get-off-me combos, hand slaps, and Phase 2 spells. She has a giant hitbox you attack with her charge that's like a lesser version of Malenia's Waterfowl Dance. Similar to Midir, you do reduce damage when hitting the boss's body, so you need to target the head. And in Phase 2, she gets a damaging aura around her that reminds me of Smelter Demon. So yeah, that's a lot of difficulty to just be shoved into one boss kit. I kind of hated Ebrietas for the first 7 hours of attempts, but I slowly learned to like it as I became more aggressive and learned more of the moveset. The main issue with Ebrietas is that she feels designed to be fought at mid-range like Manus, but if you play mid-range and she does a charge attack, then you won't have time to avoid the ginormous one-shot hitbox. So you need to either be close enough to diagonally dodge from her side, or you need to be far away enough that you have time to run away from the charge, which when done with correct positioning can also be a head opening. The main principle that all Bloodborne Beast-type bosses are designed around is to balance aggression with passivity, and Ebrietas takes this principle to the illogical conclusion. When fighting this boss, you are either positioned far to mid-range to bait out charges, or you are in the boss's face circle strafing. Anything in between is risking death from a charge. I love Fromsoft bosses with difficult positioning requirements as much as the next guy, but even after getting good at this boss, some of my deaths against the charge hitbox had me thinking, really, why is it that big? When you go into close range with the boss, if it doesn't do a head slam, it might continuously do tentacle whip combos, not giving you a chance to do increased damage to the head. So my strategy was to dive the boss while not circling too hard to bait out a head slam. Then, if she isn't doing what I want her to do, I dive out and bait out a charge attack or head slam. Then I dive again and punish the head slam attacks before finding another opportunity to escape the tentacle combos, and I'd repeat the cycle of extreme aggression and passivity. I don't know if you guys can tell, but these boss explanations for Bloodborne are probably a bit more complex than Dark Souls 1 and 2 and 3 level 1 videos, and that's because they're harder. Phase 2 steps up the gas as the boss grows wings and gets a flying one-shot charge attack with more range than the first charge, and to make it harder to play close range, the boss gains more get-off-me tentacle whip combos with additional attacks, as well as the aura of damage I mentioned before. My advice for Phase 2 is to mostly play it like a more extreme version of Phase 1 with aggression and passivity, but also to not be afraid to aggressively bait out head slams when close. He doesn't seem to do his fly attack when you're up close, and his get-off-me tentacle attacks aren't super common. Although I made this boss seem like a bit of a nightmare, because it is, literally in the lore and also in the gameplay, that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it. Well, I sort of hated it for the first 7 hours of attempts, but after that I learned to enjoy and respect this boss's attack rhythm and deep level of positioning strategies. And after a mere 11.5 hours, I had my victory. I'm going to place Ebrietas in A tier. In terms of mechanical depth, I do think it's actually an S tier boss, but the charge attack hitbox is just a bit too big, and that really got on my nerves after 10 hours of attempts, and I'd still sometimes die to it. With Ebrietas, the hardest boss in the base game of Bloodborne defeated, nothing can stand in my way. Surely most of the DLC won't be any harder than this. I regret to inform you, all of the DLC is harder than Ebrietas. I have been fighting Ludwig for 12 hours, and I've only seen Phase 2 once. If I can't beat Ludwig, then I can't even get any footage of me fighting Orphan, and I may as well give up on the video. I can feel the hope fading. People have been asking, where is Bloodborne level 4? Where is it? Ever since the channel's creation for years now, and it may never come out. So yeah, Ludwig level 4 may be the hardest boss I've ever fought up until this point. Not just in terms of Fromsoft games, but in terms of all games I've ever played. Phase 1 is one of the hardest beast fights in the game, on par with Ebrietas, only for Phase 2 to be like an Elden Ring boss full of delayed attacks and positioning openings. It'd be like if you were fighting Manus, then at half health he just turned into a giant version of Artorias, but harder and with more delayed attacks. It isn't enough to be able to beat Phase 1 Ludwig. You have to perfect Phase 1 until you can enter Phase 2 with enough consistency to actually learn the second entirely different moveset. After around 20 hours of attempts, yes, 20 hours, I had an epiphany. Despite being beaten down and uncertain if this video would ever come out, I enjoyed fighting Ludwig, because if I had to fight Phase 1 of a boss for over 20 hours, I'm happy it was the best beast boss in Bloodborne, and I'm also really happy that the boss run was short. Thank the Lord. Mechanically, I don't even know where to start with this guy. I feel like I could write up a whole strategy guide on Ludwig's positioning requirements at this point. There are 2 positioning sweet spots with Ludwig, those being his hind legs and his face. The preferred opening is his hind legs, since he'll jump away after being hit instead of attacking, and you'll get more hits in. So the obvious play would be to constantly dash to his legs, but this isn't a good idea outside of specific combos, since he can stomp you to death at any time. And it's impossible to dodge if you are too far underneath him. There are 2 combos where you can easily reach his hind legs without getting stomped to death. Those combos are dashing to his hind leg during the big claw attack combo, and dashing underneath his legs during his delayed double claw swipe. He also seems to jump away if you're underneath him during this specific attack instead of stomping on you. Just make sure you are underneath him and not behind him, or else he can horse kick you. You can also dodge left through both claws to reach the hind leg, but this timing is more strict. There are 2 other combos that let you get to the legs, those being his charge attack and bite charge frenzy, although I find it to be hard to pull off consistently. Outside of these openings, you can go for single hits to the head after some of his normal attacks, but he can respond with another attack quickly, so you have to time it well and position right next to the attack ending. The other big opening is his fire breath, which is the most obvious one. You lock off and run right. There's something about the combination of melee attacks, bite attacks, and charge attacks that makes Ludwig almost feel like if a player took control of a boss and was actually trying to kill me, as opposed to just being a moveset tree. Like the second you get too comfortable dodging his claw swipes, Ludwig will spam you with charges and bite frenzies just to trick you up, and I respect him for that. Below half health, Ludwig transforms into Phase 2 in what might be the emotional highlight of Bloodborne for me. This horse monster beast thingy remembers the hunter it used to be before it transformed, and he summons the literal Moonlight Greatsword to kill me. And my god, the Ludwig Phase 2 song is a masterpiece. There's a certain type of epicness to the fast-paced sword duels in Fromsoft games that accesses an almost ethereal-like quality to me, and to have this amazing sword duel be the conclusion to one of my favorite beast fights in all of Bloodborne, while the OST is going hard, honestly, it's my favorite moment in all of Bloodborne. My basic strategy for Phase 2 Ludwig is to do locked on circle strafing in a direction so that I can hit him while his attacks hit nothing. Then I dash into the direction of his turning attack and begin strafing in the opposite direction until he does another turning attack, and I repeat the process. If you're standing directly in front of Ludwig, he can do a quick 1-2 slash combo of death. So if you do find yourself getting caught staring Ludwig directly in the face, get ready for a quick dodge. What makes Phase 2 Ludwig so hard is that you can't cheese most of his dodge rolls and delayed attacks with something like unlock circle strafing or unlocked hit and run tactics, because his greatsword is way too long, and he has ranged attacks, and he has turning attacks to kill you as you're running around him. You gotta fight Ludwig Phase 2 like a man, and memorize almost all of his dodge rolls, and I respect him for that. After 24 hours of attempts, yes, a literal day of playtime, longer than any other FromSoft boss I've fought, I finally had Ludwig at low health. My palms were sweaty, knees weak, arms were heavy. There's vomit on his sweater already, mom's spaghetti. So yeah, I was pretty nervous. Ludwig was low, and after his 3-attack overhead combo, I went in for my opening, but I forgot. Sometimes he does a 4th attack towards my left side after his 3-attack overhead, and we ended up hitting each other at the same time. I f***ed up. But right as I was ready to put the controller down, I saw that I survived the hit with a sliver of health, and Ludwig was staggered from my attack. In a twist of fate, by making the biggest mistake in the entire fight, I had secured my victory. I felt bewildered. It was like God himself came down into the world of Bloodborne and granted me victory. Okay, I'm being overly hyperbolic now, but I was pretty stoked at the time. Oh, and if you hadn't figured it out already, I'm not going to give Ludwig S tier. I'm giving him double S tier, a masterpiece of a boss battle. Before moving on to more suffering, I think it's time I make something very clear about Bloodborne level 4. It's hard, like, maybe one of the hardest things I've ever done. Usually I try to make these videos inviting to people, trying to get them to push past their limits and try out a level 1 run, because a level 1 run of Dark Souls 3 or Dark Souls 1 might not be as hard or as scary as you think. A level 4 run of Bloodborne is exactly as scary as you think, probably more. This game is relentless. It has the long boss runs of Dark Souls 1 and 2, and it has the jank lock-on of Dark Souls 1 where you can only run forwards and not sideways or backwards when locked on. And it has the Dark Souls 1 jank jumping, where if you try to dodge at the end of a run, you'll jump without iframes and you can die to that. And it has a bunch of oversized hitboxes. And all of this is combined with the game's bosses having the speed and length of Dark Souls 3 boss combos. But because of all the big hitboxes, dodge roll spamming doesn't seem to work nearly as well in Bloodborne as it does in Dark Souls 3. But we're not done. There's more. Because Bloodborne also has the positioning requirements of Elden Ring, but it achieves it in a different way. In Elden Ring, positioning requirements are usually about circling bosses so you can hit them during their openings to build posture damage. While in Bloodborne, tons of bosses have you die attacks like Ebrietas' charge or Ludwig's stomp, where a giant hitbox can come out at a moment's notice. So whenever you get an opening, you must take it in a position where you can dodge all possible attacks that may follow. Bloodborne bosses also tend to have a lot of delayed attacks you need to memorize through trial and error like in Elden Ring. However, to compensate for Elden Ring's difficulty, a lot of the bosses didn't have big health bars, but that's not true in Bloodborne. A lot of these boss health bars are as ginormous as bosses found in Dark Souls 3's DLC. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Bloodborne level 4 is like a compilation of the hardest things about every Fromsoft game smashed into one impossible challenge run. I remember watching LobosJr stream his Elden Ring level 1 video a few years back, and I asked him what the hardest level 1 run was. I asked him this to validate my own opinion that Elden Ring level 1 was way harder than Dark Souls, but no, he did not tell me that. He told me that Bloodborne level 4 was the hardest. I brushed this off, thinking that he only said that because Bloodborne was the first fast-paced Fromsoft game and he had a hard time adjusting. Sure, it may be harder than Dark Souls 3 overall, but there's no way it's more challenging than Elden Ring. I made like a campaign of videos against that game, nothing can be harder than that game. But looking back on it, LobosJr was right. Bloodborne level 4 is truly the most difficult low-level Fromsoft run. To be fair, Elden Ring might become harder when the DLC comes out, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I was very conflicted on what to name this video, and I might still change it, because overall I do think a lot of Bloodborne is better at level 4, although some of the worser parts are a little bit worse. But it doesn't really matter, because it's so difficult it transcends simple categories like good or bad, right or wrong. It may be more appropriate to say that Bloodborne is a nightmare at level 4, and only the most dedicated Fromsoft fans should attempt this challenge. The Blood level 4 run has taken so long that I decided to not fight the 21 Chalice dungeon bosses because it would take too long and make the video too long. But still, I decided to beat every boss in the base game and the DLC, although there was one boss I almost skipped entirely, which is Laurence. He is a reskin of the first boss Cleric Beast with fire explosions to be more annoying, and to top it off he has an awful boss run in Bloodborne tradition. The boss run forces you to engage in a mini obstacle course for just a single attempt. I was planning on fighting the boss for a few hours, giving up, and then placing him in Dark Souls 2 tier as a joke before moving on. However, after a few hours of attempts, I got him kinda low and I thought, maybe I can do this. Then my ego took over and I perfected the boss's first phase, and after about 10 hours I optimized the boss until I realized that I actually liked it. I feel like some people are expecting me to hate on this boss because it's a reskin with a long boss run, hence why I was going to put it in Dark Souls 2 tier, but they added so much depth to Cleric Beast's moveset that I can't do that. Phase 1 starts out pretty simple. You shouldn't circle strafe because you'll get hit by his fire and Laurence's blind spot attacks, so you bait out his combo finishers and play it safe. Then in phase 1.5, he starts jumping around the arena with splashes of fire where you need to roll into him and then quickly get away. And he even changes a few of his combos where he jumps onto the ground after you. And if you can predict this, you can dive around his side to get big damage on his back during the combo. At around a third health, the boss has a twist, with a real phase 2 where his legs blow up and he desperately crawls after you and spews out lava. You have to dodge the beast's arms while he crawls towards you without stepping on the lava trail that he leaves behind in his wake, which adds a level of challenge to the positioning that I find fun. Also, the music when you're fighting this crippled monster has no reason to be as amazing as it is. It has a triumphant, almost Zelda-like feel to part of its melody. And just like with Ludwig, I got nervous after 15-ish hours of attempts and Laurence and I hit each other at the same time. However, this time, I didn't survive and I died. And we both died together. Honestly, I have no idea where to rank this boss. The boss run was awful for a boss that is already extremely hard, and the boss is a reskin, but mechanically and thematically, this might be the most fun reskin I've ever fought in a Fromsoft game. F it, I'm giving Laurence A tier. This may be the biggest opinion turnaround I've ever had on a Fromsoft boss where I went from below F to A tier, but just because I ended up liking Laurence, that doesn't mean that I won't still create a spot below F tier because hot damn, Living Failures is just terrible at level 4. Genuinely, this was a low point of the entire run. At least ROM only took like an hour to beat. Living Failures was 5.5 hours of torture. You can parry and backstab Living Failures, but at level 4 visceral attacks do severely reduce damage even when I have a rune increasing visceral attack damage by 20%. This means that for a lot of the fight, I just had to fight Living Failures legit without going for parries like I would on a normal run, and it was awful. Do you guys remember earlier in the video when I said that I didn't like how Bloodstarved Beast was simple and overly punishing? And did you also remember when I said I didn't enjoy the randomness of the 1v3 multi-fight with Shadows of Yharnam? Well, take all of the worst parts of both of those bosses and shove them into one nightmare and you've got Living Failures. Instead of 3 enemies, I've got to keep track of 4, and they all have overly simple movesets that 1 and 2 shot me at level 4, and they have an endlessly large supply of health, the worst of all worlds. My basic strat for Living Failures is as follows. Run to one end of the boss arena to separate the melee fighters from the spellcasters, then run to the furthest spellcaster and circle strafe hit him. I do this because the spellcasters usually don't attack back much with one-shot melee attacks, although sometimes they do, so don't ever get too confident. If he starts casting a spell while you're circle strafing him and the melee fighters are kind of far away, you can go for a backstab, but you usually can't do that safely. And that's about all of the strategy I use in this boss. Sometimes when you get bored, you go for the occasional parry on a melee enemy, but don't mess up or else you can get one shot. There's no depth, no complexity, just monotony and running around and claw gripping my controller to run and use the camera, which kind of hurt my finger after a while. And it's also overly punishing. Unfortunately, it gets worse. In Phase 2, they will summon an easy-to-avoid meteor shower that gives you free openings, which sounds great because it will make the boredom end faster, but I swear to God it confuses the AI. Immediately after the meteor attack happens, they all attack the air usually. But after they do this, the melee fighters don't seem to re-engage right away, or only one will re-engage while the other one lags behind. And then it's kind of hard to see who's the spellcaster and who's the melee fighter, because they aren't really attacking me and they just clump together and give me no openings. Eventually the AI will re-engage, but by that point they're already about to do another meteor summon attack and then it will mess up their AI again to drag out the fight. The AI crapping itself makes the fight take even longer than it already should. This fight was not meant to be played at level 4. As I said before with ROM, I'd love it if Living Failures was just optional and you could fight Laurence here instead maybe, because I'd just skip it, but all of the worst Bloodborne bosses block the way to better bosses to force you to play them, I guess. My final attempt for Living Failures took over 19 minutes. There are two good things about Living Failures. Firstly, just like with Laurence and Ludwig, their Phase 2 song is very, very good. And secondly, upon defeat, they drop a checkpoint so you don't have to do a boss run for the next boss, Maria. I'm going to stick Living Failures in Failure tier below Rom. Originally, I was going to put Rom in his own Rom tier, but Living Failures were so difficult and boring that when considering to do another level 4 run, I will think about them and not want to do it. And Rom isn't so bad that he makes me not want to play the game. With Living Failures out of the way, there's only good, high-quality bosses over the horizon, and first up is Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower, the epic hunter boss of the DLC. The best way to describe Lady Maria at level 4 is easy to learn but hard to master. I was able to see her second phase after only several attempts as opposed to something like the 10 plus hours it took me to see Ludwig phase 2, but it still took me around 10 or 11 hours to fully beat Maria because she's pretty difficult to perfect. Phase 1 isn't too hard. Against her sword moveset, you can dodge all of her combos by walking or dodging forward left, and you'll usually have time to punish her afterwards. You'll stagger her with your hits, but she has a delayed hyper armor attack, so you can't get too greedy and you should only go for 2 or 3 attacks at a time. She can transition to her spear moveset in Phase 1 where you can basically do the same thing and dodge forward left. She tends to shoot her gun a lot more with this weapon, so kind of like with Gascoigne, you have to be ready to predict the quick dodge. In Phase 2, Maria gets a lot harder for 3 main reasons. Firstly, dodging forward left against all her attacks no longer works, and now you have to start dodging forward right to avoid most of her giant hitboxes, except for her hyper armor delayed attack that still requires a forward left dodge, so you have to keep in mind the multiple dodge roll directions. The second reason she's so hard is because many of her attacks come out very quickly, while others have a slight delay to punish quick dodges, which is a classic Fromsoft strategy to kill the player a bunch. The third difficult thing about Maria is how she'll crouch and charge up a giant one-shot attack that comes out with different timings. The important thing to keep in mind is that if she raises the spear above her head, then the attack will come out after a short delay, but if she crouches for a sword swing or a spear stab, then it will be the same timing of a long delay, and if you circle around to her right side, then you can dodge the sword slash without dashing. But her spear stab will target you even if you're behind her, so you always need to dodge that one. In Phase 3, Maria adds a trail of fire to all of her sword swings just to make every dodge timing more precise. Overall, I'd describe Maria as a classic From Software boss duel. She's fast-paced, easy to learn but hard to master, and I love her presentation of dual-wielding flaming blood katanas. I like bosses like Ludwig Phase 2 or Maria Phases 2 and 3 that escalate the epicness of the boss moveset as the fight progresses. It adds a layer of intense passion to the fight that gets my heart pumping. And better than all of that, Maria doesn't have a boss run. S tier. Never before has a video game beaten me down this much. Orphan of Kos has stolen more time and energy out of me than any other challenge in any video game I've ever played. My level 1 runs of Dark Souls 1 and 3 took around 3 to 4 days to complete, yet here I am, 2.5 weeks into my Blood level 4 run, and I still can't beat Orphan of Kos. More than anger, I am tired. Tired of being beaten down. Tired of failure. Tired of never being enough. The hours turned into days, and the days turned into a prison. A prison inside of a nightmare, shared only by me, and a failed abortion. I stopped seeing Bloodborne as a game, and I began to see it as a punishment. I started to see myself as the virtualized embodiment of Sisyphos, damned by the gods to roll a boulder uphill, and just when he would get it to reach the top of the hill, the boulder would be cursed to roll back down for all of eternity. I am Sisyphos, and Kos is my boulder. It took 12 hours to see Phase 2 once, and many more to see it consistently. But every time Phase 2 begins, his eccentric moveset with giant hitboxes, one-shots, and no clear rhythm would send the boulder tumbling back down. After 24 hours of attempts, I had to admit, that I was no closer to victory against Phase 2 than when I was fighting him 15 hours in, and that victory was nigh impossible. For the first time since I got stuck fighting Quelaag in the depths of Blighttown on my first run of my first Fromsoft game, I was truly uncertain if victory was even possible. Alas, I was defeated. But there was one more tool at my disposal, the internet, and what I found shocked me. No one can really beat Orphan of Kos Phase 2 in a legitimate way, like how you'd beat Ludwig or Manus by consistently engaging with their moveset. Instead, what most people do is bait out Kos's jumping attacks, memorize where he lands, prepare a charged heavy to his back before he can continue the combo for a stagger, then do 2 more charged heavies that will stagger chain the boss before finishing with a visceral attack to the back. If you do this with weapon buffs and the best weapon gems, and you backstab chain Kos during the start of his Phase 2 transformation, then you can beat Kos with only landing 2 or 3 real hits while his moveset is active. Other ways of besting Kos is to try to do a backstab visceral attack chain like with what LobosJr did, and I've seen some people hit him with light attacks during a few other openings in addition to doing backstab chains, but I can't find any footage of anyone beating Kos level 4 without backstabs, parries, and weapon buffs. It could be possible to fight Kos aggressively and kill him with only light attacks, and maybe I just haven't found the footage, but I've yet to see the evidence for this. And even if it was possible, it would take an astronomically long amount of time for me to learn it. I'm going to list out the following reasons as to why Kos Phase 2 Level 4 is so impossible. Firstly, he can throw a swarm of placenta grenades out at any time to one-shot the player. Most of the time when he does this, it's somewhat predictable, but some of the time when you're playing aggressively, he'll just jump into the air and throw the placenta grenades onto the ground, and I'm not really sure on how to always avoid it. But even if you figure out a way to avoid that attack, there's more. When Kos does a charge attack, instead of his front being a hitbox, the air behind his back is a one-shot hitbox, and he can do the charge attack basically at any time, which is a very unfair way to die. And another way the game punishes you for trying to play aggressive with circling. But even if you figure out a way to predict every bad one-shot hitbox, a bigger issue with Kos is that he rarely gives clear openings, and he usually doesn't have much of a predictive rhythm to his moveset. When I was trying to kill Kos with only light attacks, he'd sometimes just keep spam jumping away and throwing placenta grenades. Then he'd charge forward, land on the other side of the arena, then he'd jump away again and throw more grenades. He throws so many grenades out of his placenta, you think he'd run out of placenta eventually and you just win that way, but no, it's infinite, the placenta of gods. In other words, although a light attack only level 4 Kos win may be possible, it doesn't seem very fair or practical. Melania is the hardest boss in Elden Ring because of her giant "F you I win" attack, but almost all of Kos's Phase 2 kit is a "F you I win" attack. The way I see it, Orphan of Kos Phase 2 is such an impossible challenge that the developers gave Kos an Achilles heel, that being his back, and most challenge runners just choose to exploit his obvious weakness. And although it may seem like a cheese way to win at level 4, trust me, it's fairly difficult to land fully charged heavy attacks to Kos's back, especially since he has the most unpredictable boss AI in the series. To me, Phase 1 Kos plays out like a standard Fromsoft duel, while Phase 2 is not a duel at all. It's more like you're trying to survive being locked in an arena with a raging bull, but the bull is the son of God. When it comes to ranking Orphan of Kos, I am deeply conflicted. On one hand, I do have a serious complaint about Orphan, which is that he has so many oversized hitboxes to add artificial difficulty that it starts to feel like a fast-paced Dark Souls 2 boss. Kos's overhead swing is just stupidly oversized, and if you dash forward right during a spin attack, you can get tossed into the air, lose your iframes, and die. When I have to fight Phase 1 of a boss over and over and over again to reach Phase 2 only to die to bullshit, it really hurts my willpower to keep going. In some way, I feel unqualified to rank Kos, because if I'm being honest, I had stopped enjoying the challenge run after Ludwig and Laurence. I hated living failures, and although I liked Maria, I was burning on the fumes of passion that I felt during the challenge run's beginning. In fact, I was so tired that I told a few of my friends that I haven't been this mentally exhausted since the ACT test in high school. I was so very tired, and for the first time I found myself going hollow and giving up on the challenge entirely. Dark Souls 2 Level 1 does not count. Albert Camus once said, "The struggle itself to the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This sounds good on paper, but honestly, that. Just like with what Nietzsche said, man needs a reason to suffer. Originally, my reason to do these challenge runs was for my enjoyment, but now it's grown into something more. I don't want to disappoint all of the people who were looking forward to my Bloodborne level 4 video, so no matter how many hours it took, I struggled on, through every death and every disappointment. In order to optimize the boss, I statted my weapon to deal more damage against open enemies, which is a way of dealing more damage after Kos is down from a backstab to increase the DPS of backstab chains. To go along with this strategy, I further optimized Phase 1 Kos by learning more backstab openings so I could reach Phase 2 more often. And after around 36 to 40 hours of attempts, yes, longer than any other boss I've ever fought in any game, I finally had a good run on my hands. My controller, no, my entire body was drenched in sweat. I kept finding backstab opportunities, and every time I made a mistake, I got lucky and avoided the hit, or I didn't get one shot. Finally, my time had come. Kos came in for a simple jumping attack, and I instinctively dodged it and readied my charged attack right away. But before I could stagger him, Kos jumped back into the air to come down and one-shot me. My eternal imprisonment would never end. And yet I would not die. Seeing Kos in the air, I instinctively turned the analog stick away from him, causing my character to attack in the opposite direction, and the momentum from my charged heavy was enough to move me out of the way of the one-shot attack, allowing me to charge another heavy and backstab stagger chain Kos. By a miracle of the gods, Kos's landing hitbox was actually fair, and I managed to dodge it within centimeters of death with the momentum from my cleaver swing. Now Kos is one backstab chain away from death, but since I'm level 4, I'm always one hit away from death anyways. As long as I don't mess anything up again, victory is guaranteed. But Kos wouldn't give me any openings. He kept throwing his placenta grenades everywhere, but I knew better than to be aggressive against Kos. You can never be aggressive against Kos. The air around his back is a one-shot attack. You have to let him come to you. Eventually, he did come to me with his most predictable attack, which was a flurry rush into a jump combo, and I punished it perfectly. Finally, the battle, no, the war, was over. I couldn't believe it. This whole time I kept telling myself, finally I will beat Kos and I will feel relieved. But upon defeating him, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel any relief or happiness that I expected, no. Instead, I felt surprised and confused. Am I allowed to stop fighting Kos every day? Am I truly worthy to leave this prison? I haven't felt this way since I graduated high school, and abruptly the boredom I was cursed to suffer every day ended artificially for no other reason than society deemed it my prison sentence had to conclude at 18. And yet, whether locked in a prison or free, whether alive or dead, the sun will rise and fall with each passing day, indifferent to the suffering of the humans beneath its fiery gaze. For God does not care about Sisyphus. After all, it was God who damned Sisyphus to roll the boulder uphill, only to watch it fall down with each passing day. I will not place Kos into S tier, or A tier, or any of the damn tiers. I will place the Orphan of Kos into Sisyphus tier, for to me he is more than a video game boss. To me, he is a symbol of the overwhelming challenge that humans suffer to overcome, even when victory seems cursed to be impossible. Welcome to my last day of playing Bloodborne level 4, a 2.5 week long challenge run. Even though it was painful, it feels almost nostalgic knowing that it's shortly going to come to an end. One final victory lap of 3 bosses in the final day before I can close the book on this chapter of my life and move on to greener pastures. First up is Mergo's Wet Nurse, and to state some positives, this boss looks really cool and it's creative as it looks like a multi-headed cloaked angel of death. Okay, now for the negatives. It isn't really fun to fight. Basically, you can do hit and run tactics to easily get hits in, but every once in a while it will attack with all of its arms, forcing you to run around to its back to get a hit in, only for it to fly away. Eventually, it will summon a black mist and have duplicates attack you for a long period of time, forcing me to run around in circles, bored out of my mind for about 40 seconds each time. I've heard that there's an exploit that allows you to cancel this black mist attack, but since it doesn't seem intended, I will rank the boss factoring this boring attack in, and if you couldn't guess it already, that rank will be F tier. With Mergo's Wet Nurse out of the way, we can proceed to the finale of Bloodborne and fight Gerhman, the first hunter. One thing that's great about Bloodborne is how they managed to make every hunter-type boss feel so unique, and Gerhman is no exception. When fighting his Scythe moveset, he has so many hyper armor attacks that you can't safely go for even 2 hits without risking death. So my strategy is to go for heavy and charged heavy attacks to maximize the damage for a single hit. Gerhman's second dagger gun moveset is also a bit tricky because his gunshots can one-shot you at level 4. My strategy for this was to circle right and follow him until I got my chance for a stagger chain. In Phase 2, Gerhman adds hyper armor to both of his weapon movesets and adds in a few new attacks for his Scythe moveset. As you guys know, I was pretty tired of the challenge run at this point, and I found an exploit to make the boss easier. If you play aggressively in Phase 2, he will never switch from his dagger gun moveset to his Scythe moveset, meaning that you'll never have to learn how to dodge the additional Phase 2 Scythe attacks, and in my final attempt, he never used his Scythe in Phase 2 even once. By my standards, this is kind of a cheesy way to win, but I was so tired and didn't want to add a few more hours to the run learning more dodge timing, so that's what I did. Overall, Gerhman is a great fight, and is made even better at level 4. An epic hunter duel with great music, and similar to Maria, he doesn't have a boss run, so I'll put him in S tier. Also, on a side note, I think that Bloodborne has my favorite From Software soundtrack, up there with Dark Souls 3 as the 2 best. With Gerhman dead, a giant Cthulhu monster descends from the skies and tries to eat me, but since I ape 3/3 of umbilical cords from the Great Ones, he isn't able to consume me and instead tries to murder me. I swear to God, Bloodborne's story makes less sense than any other FromSoft game, but I'm no lore expert, so I didn't want to make a section of the video talking about that, and I was certain that it would just be every comment in the comment section disagreeing with me, so I think the most common defense for Bloodborne's story is that it's supposed to be mysterious because of the cosmic horror, but I just think it's like too ambiguous. Either way, it doesn't matter because we're here for the boss ranking, and the final boss Moon Presence is another great one. He has a fast-paced franticness to his moveset that caught me off guard on my first several attempts, but don't be fooled. He can be defeated with the same principles of beast-type bosses as every other one in the game, which is to find a perfect balance between aggression and passivity. The main strategy to beat this boss is to run away and bait out his charge attacks. Then during the end of the charge attack, I dash in and hit him while he tries to attack his blind spot but misses. Then I get away before he is able to land his tail whip attack. Once at low health, the boss gets more tricky, and the white balls that explode into blood will make you unable to heal with blood vials for a period of time. And with his other attack, he can sap all of your health out, forcing you to regain it quickly with the rally mechanic during your opening. Moon Presence is another fun beast boss with a few creative twists, but I don't love him as much as Gerhman, so I'll put him in A tier. A fun high note to end off an incredible game. Honestly, I can't believe that I made it to the end of this video and I am now in the conclusion. I still can't believe that the nightmare is finally over. Normally after a level 1 run of a FromSoft game, I feel a sense of triumph and accomplishment, but not this time. This time I feel traumatized. Only the bravest souls should try to overcome this nightmare at level 4. As always, I will conclude this video by saying what Bloodborne means to me as a game. To me, Bloodborne is one of the most refined Fromsoft games in terms of combat and level design, but it's held back by a few bad required bosses, some overly long boss runs, and performance limitations with long death loading screens and 30 frames per second as a result of being locked to PS4 hardware. I guess what I'm trying to say is that a Bloodborne remake or remaster on PC or PS5 could fine-tune the worser elements of this game and turn it into a near-perfect experience. And for the love of God, Fromsoft, if you do make a Bloodborne remaster, get rid of jump and roll sharing the same button. This game is way too hard to have Dark Souls 1 jank. If you guys made it this far and enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing or donating to the channel on Patreon. And if you're lucky, I might even try to beat Elden Ring DLC at level 1, if I'm capable of it, that is. Alright guys, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.